Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to those who are here at Villarigau, and welcome to those who are online with us. My name is Anne Tudwong, and I am a co-director of the Geneva Cities Hub here in Geneva. Just a few housekeeping before we start really the event, just to let you know that the event will be conducted in English only, no interpretation, unfortunately. The event is being recorded and it will be posted online on our website, but also I think on the International Institute for Environment and Development website as well. And in those who are following us online, use the Q&A box for your comments and questions, please, so that we can take them during the Q&A session. So the Geneva Cities Hub is an organization which mission is to better connect cities and other local and regional governments to the international community here in Geneva. In a world that is indeed more urbanized, day after day, we believe it is important to better include them on the international stage alongside states, civil society, academia, international organization, the private sector, and so on. So we're very pleased to partner today with the International Institute for Environment and Development, and I'll refer to them as IIED later, I think it's easier, and Switzerland for this event held ahead of the High Commissioner for Refugees Dialogue on Protection Challenges that will start tomorrow. So special thanks to Lucy Earle, who is unfortunately not with us today, but you've been really a pillar to the event. So many thanks to you for everything you've done. So we all know that today, the majority of the world's displaced people lead out of camps in cities in search of opportunities for better life. And we also assume that refugees and IDPs are better off in cities. Yet, solid evidence on this topic was lacking until the IIED decided to undertake a very large-scale study comparing refugee well-being and livelihoods in camps and in urban areas. So I feel very pleased and very privileged today that we all gathered here to hear about the emerging findings from this groundbreaking study, about what this means in terms of opportunities and challenges for the main stakeholders, that is refugees, municipal authorities, but also, of course, humanitarian development actors, national governments who are with us within the audience. So first, allow me to give the floor to Patricia Barandon, who is with us from the Swiss Development Agency for Development Cooperation, which supported the study. The floor is yours for opening remarks.
Thank you, Anto, and thank you very much for inviting me to provide some opening remarks. On behalf of SDC, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, I'd like to welcome you all who have come here and also our participants online to discuss cities for refugees. As you said, Anto, cities are growing rapidly. Already today, half of the world's population lives in urban areas, and urbanization will continue at rapid speed around the world. And the connection with the refugees is that cities attract not only refugees, but all sorts of migrants for different reasons, for reasons of education, for reasons of seeking jobs, for reasons of seeking health services, and so on. Cities also are pockets of poverty and inequality, and this is where the mandate of the Swiss Development Cooperation kicks in. Our mission is to reduce poverty worldwide, and looking at the growth of cities and the number of migrants living in cities, it became clear to us a few years ago that we have to look at urban poverty and to reflect on what makes cities places for people to thrive. Now, for sure, SDC has been for years and years and years engaged in the space of rural poverty, and we are always making this connection. You come from somewhere and you go somewhere, you leave a place, and we also need to kind of connect where people come from. We say in our section, we have to look at these migration corridors. So I'm always interested to see, person might end up in a city, but she comes or he comes from somewhere, and also look at what happens to the places where people come from. So, as I said, we, a few years ago, grappled around the issue of urbanization and started to build a portfolio of urban migration program. It includes partners as City Alliance, Mayors Migration Council, and many others, and also our more humanitarian-oriented work nowadays, very important for us, also the issue of durable solutions, and this is also something I would be interested to hear also from this research, to what extent cities are able to provide durable solutions, which means reducing protection needs or altogether eliminating protection needs of refugees. Now, in terms of our urban portfolio, and I think many partners are working on projects which go beyond infrastructure needs and which include creating social cohesion between migrants and host communities, so that all inhabitants have their rights protected and can contribute to and participate in economic and social life. And if I understand correctly, our aim today is look at the positive side of the contribution of refugees and migrants to the development of cities, which I think is a very important angle to look at. Now, for sure, local authorities have a significant role to play when it comes to serving migrants and forcibly displaced persons. They are, so to say, the front line, the first ones to be confronted with challenges people with a migration background face. So I'm very interested to hear also maybe what recommendations people who work with local authorities have, or maybe what the findings of the studies are in this respect. Now, when people are forced to flee their homes and become refugees, there are different ways in which they're housed and hosted. Refugee camps, often planned for temporary shelter, have become homes to millions of people, but Antu has already said it, the interesting part of today's discussion is a refugee camp versus a city. What's the difference in terms of how people manage their life? And I'm very interested to also hear what are some of the recommendations. And it was already mentioned that camps are not the choice of the majority of the world's displaced people, as it is estimated that more than 60% of refugees and at least half of the internally displaced persons live in urban areas nowadays. So this is where our research comes in. This poses the question about advantages and disadvantages for refugees when living in camps or in cities. What we will hear today are the findings from what, to my knowledge, is the first study looking into this topic, comparing the impact of camps and urban environment on the lives and livelihoods of refugees, returnees, and internally displaced persons. Now, for sure, for the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, financing studies is on the one hand an opportunity to generate data and evidence for the setup and steering of our own projects, of our policy influencing, of our multilateral dialogue. On the other hand, it always begs the question, what now? What do we do with the results? In the case of this study by the International Institute for Environment and Development, I'm confident that the findings will influence the way we assess the opportunities that cities can generate for refugees and their well-being. It is my hope as well that the study informs and shapes the understanding of the immense potential that migrants, including refugees, bring to a city if they can thrive. So I'm now eager to hear from the distinguished panelists and would like to thank the Geneva Cities Hub for hosting this event today. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Patricia. And I'm now turning to Lucy. You hear all the expectations that lie on your study. Lots of them, lots of questions. So you are, Lucy, the Director of the Human Settlement Groups at the International Institute for Environment and Development based in London. You've been running the research project since 2020 with a whole team of researchers. And you have a bit more than 15 minutes to present what are the emergent findings of your important projects. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Antu, and thank you very much, Patricia, and to STC for hosting this event. And my apologies for not being there in person. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes, we hear you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to present initial findings from our project. It's a 3.5-year comparative study of well-being and livelihoods in camps and urban areas in 4 countries. And we will run until the end of October next year, and we're sort of deep in the analysis phase. So what you're getting here is preliminary results. And it's great to be able to present at this stage to get feedback from people about where we think we could take our analysis. We have a huge amount of data, and there are many directions we could go in. The project is initially funded by the UK government's Global Challenges Research Fund, and they were very grateful when STC stepped in to support when there were some funding challenges in the UK government. You can see our list of partners on the right there. We're working with universities, University of Cardiff, we're leading on the refugee economies side of the work, displacement economies. Also working with universities, the Maseno in Kenya, Dilla University in Ethiopia, the Hashemite University of Jordan. We're working with the social enterprise Samuel Hall, and I believe some colleagues from Samuel Hall are going to be online. They're leading in Afghanistan, and they're also helping us with our statistical analysis. So any more complicated questions around our data, I will hand over to colleagues in Samuel Hall. We'll also have some fantastic civil society and activist partners in SDI Kenya and the Women's Refugee Commission. And we're working with some small NGOs in Ethiopia, DICAC and Mismido, and with research centres, including the Phoenix Centre in Jordan. So moving on to my next slide, I hope. My slides are not moving on. Oh, there must be a delay. So the aims of the project: to build an evidence base on the opportunities and challenges of hosting displaced people in camps and urban areas, to promote an assessment of current responses to urban protracted displacement, and in particular raising awareness of unmet need in cities, and working with municipal authorities, displaced people's organisations, federations of the urban poor, other local actors, to work together to come up with development-based solutions to forced displacement. And that's the participatory angle of the research project that you'll hear more about from Sam later on today. The project's in 4 countries, as I mentioned. We're in Kenya, Ethiopia, Jordan, and Afghanistan, and in a camp and an urban area in each country. Now, those of you with sharp eyes will see that in Jordan, the map says we're working in Azraq, but on the left it says we're working in Zatri. Now, I left this discrepancy on purpose to remind me to say that we had originally planned to work in Azraq, and unfortunately we're not permitted to do so. I do think our results would look very different if we'd been able to do our work in Azraq, and I want to come back to that later. In general terms, we tried where we could to work with the same ethnic group in the camp and the city to have that comparison. This wasn't possible in Ethiopia, where we had to move our focus from the Tigray region because of the conflict. So we ended up working with Afari refugees in Ethiopia, and we actually added on a small city close to a Seta camp so that we could do a comparison of Afari refugees in camp and urban, as there are very few Afari in Addis. So the comparison, I should say, is mainly between the camp and the urban, not between countries, but that is also an option for us. It's a mixed method survey. So we had concept generating focus groups when we were asking refugees and other displaced people, what does well-being mean to you? What does it mean to live a good life? What is a productive livelihood? What does self-reliance mean? We developed a survey, and then that was reviewed by expert panels in each country. Then we ran the surveys. We've got around 400 refugees, men and women in the camp in each country, 400 in the urban. And then we did also interview hosts, although we're not going to look at their data today for a reason I can explain later. We also did qualitative work, 50 per country, split between the wellbeing component of the research, it's run by IID, and livelihoods, it's run by our colleagues in Cardiff University, and then following up with the key informant interviews and ongoing forums at city level, the participatory aspect that I just mentioned. And this slide, I think, is wonderful. This is my colleagues, Samuel Hall, showing all the different languages that we ran our survey in. I'm not actually going to talk about Afghanistan today, although we did gather data with IDPs and returnees in Afghanistan. But because the population there that we work with are citizens, their circumstances are a bit different. And actually, when I come to discuss the model we've created for understanding well-being, there's a bias towards people who are legal, who are citizens and have legal resident status. So we're not going to talk about them today, but we have recently launched a press release. We have some really exciting data from Afghanistan, really interesting. We were actually able to collect our survey data in Afghanistan just before the Taliban takeover. And then we were able to recontact a significant number of those participants by phone for a follow-up survey 1 year later to look at how their lives have changed over that period. And we will be producing some briefing papers and around that data, which is kind of a subset of this overall research. So one of the main innovations of this work is the way that we're looking and thinking about well-being. And we've actually developed a well-being framework and metric to measure the difference between the camp and the urban. And the motivation behind this is to really get away from these sort of standard vulnerability assessments that is a tendency to use with people who've been displaced. And our feeling is that when you've been living in a camp or an urban area, particularly an urban area, for 10, 15 or 20 years of protracted displacement, it's not enough just to be thinking about whether somebody has enough to eat, or whether they have access to medical care. Clearly those things are important, but it takes more than that to live a good life. And that's what we're really looking for. What does a good life look like in the city in particular for somebody who's experiencing displacement? And we, through our research, we actually hadn't intended to do this because of COVID. We pivoted more towards our quantitative data. We got our survey done. It was easier to do that than some of our qualitative work. And we ended up, under the guidance of our colleagues at Samuel Hall, producing a well-being metric from our survey data across 5 dimensions of well-being. And these are the 5 dimensions: bodily, economic, political, social, and psychosocial. And there's around 7 to 10 indicators within each of those dimensions. And this is all quite experimental, it's all quite early days. And we are going to be producing a more academic paper quite soon that explains why we chose these dimensions, what we're trying to achieve with this work. But there's all going to be all sorts of fascinating things we'll be able to do with this data, including starting to correlate between these dimensions. If you have good economic well-being, do you have good social well-being or psychosocial well-being? We haven't run those regressions yet, but we will. And we'll also be looking at personal characteristics, whether there are certain people who are doing better in certain areas because of issues, because of perhaps their sex, their age, their levels of education, how long they've been displaced, for example. But at a very simplest level, we did this research expecting to find that overall well-being is higher for refugees in urban areas than in camps, as Antu said in her introduction. And overall, this does play out more or less as we anticipated in Ethiopia and Kenya, where overall well-being scores are higher in the urban areas. So I have not too many of these graphs, these slides with this kind of information on. I'm not going to overwhelm you with this. But these 2 box plots, you have on the left, apologies, it's quite small, you have Ethiopia, and on the right, you have Kenya. Along the bottom, you have a scale of 0 to 1, and that's the overall well-being score. So that's the 5 dimensions condensed into just one number per person on a scale of 0 to 1, where 1 would be your ultimate well-being. You see the blue curve is the urban population of displaced people, and the red curve is those who are displaced in camps. And the vertical line is the median. And you can see quite clearly that the blue vertical line is further towards better well-being for in urban areas in both Ethiopia and Kenya. But there are variations across these 5 dimensions. And the differences between urban areas and camps are not the same. And so they are particularly important in the areas of bodily well-being. So that's issues around shelter, food, access to healthcare, etc. and around economic well-being. So that's having an income, being able to borrow money if you need to, having access to finance. And so I have another set of slides where we sort of present this data at sort of very high level. Here, this is the bodily well-being score. So on the left, you have the box chart again for Ethiopia, on the right for Kenya. But this time, the red and blue is men and women. And so on the left, you have, you see the median line is now horizontal and the body well score going up the y-axis. But you can see that on the left, men and women's horizontal line in terms of their economic well-being is lower in the camp than it is in the urban area. And you can see the same pattern. Apologies, you've lost the name of the country, but Kenya is the box chart on the right. You can see the same pattern. And it's a similar story for economic well-being, although here you see in Kenya on the right, you see a big difference in the city between men and women. So something to say about the bodily well-being scores, a lot of that difference between the camp and the urban is being driven by food and hunger. So according to our survey, 60% of respondents in Dadaab did not have enough food at some point in the previous 7 days. Refugees who lived in Dadaab since the 90s have reported a reduction in provision of food, and then we've also seen a reduction in food provision in a Seta camp in Ethiopia's Afar region, where refugees reported to us that food rations have been reduced so far it was no longer possible to live on what was provided. And almost 80% of respondents there also described the quality of their healthcare as low. So these are really quite stark differences between the camp and the urban. But in the other dimensions, the results are not as clear, and they often appear more linked to gender than location. We saw that indicators for women are worse in Kenya, but there's not so much difference in Ethiopia. But overall, the differences aren't as stark as we had hypothesized. We have to recognize that it doesn't tell the exact story we thought it would across the urban and the camp. And in Jordan, you can see that these curves are really, really similar. And the line showing the well-being score of displaced in camp is ever so slightly further to the right than the urban score. So I will come back to the point about Jordan, because I think it's quite an interesting one. But what's interesting is our qualitative work really paints quite a different picture. And this is a quote from a woman in Dadaab who's been living there since 1992. And we have this illustration that we've used for a blog that's been published today on IID's website that covers some of this information, but provides some more details, some more picture from quotes from the camps and from the urban areas. And this idea that the camp is like, being in a camp is like suffocating in a bottle, basically. And what's really interesting is we heard from quite a few people who've been able to experience both the camp and the urban area. So here, this is a very long quote. I'm not going to read it all out, but there's a real desperation here from this woman who is now living in Amman, in a neighborhood called Swele, a low-income neighborhood. But she and her family, with her 2 daughters, they got sent to Azraq several times. I mean, they left the camp straight away. There was this desperation and we wanted to get out. Why? We couldn't stay. I can't just wait around and waiting for people to give me things. They got out of the Azraq, got basically, I suppose, arrested in Amman and sent back to the camp. And that happened 3 times. And they were so desperate they got out, and they lived under extremely difficult circumstances, unregistered in Amman for several years. Another woman in Swele is saying, well, the problems of the camps are different. I mean, I may have to pay rent, but at least I have a house. I'm living in a house. I have to pay the electricity bill, but she gets electricity, and she's there. She's able to see this comparison between the camp and the urban. So what's also interesting is that when we had these conversations, sort of free-flowing conversations in semi-structured interviews and focus groups, talking to refugees in the camps, they really talked about this idea of being in a prison, an open-air prison in the camps. And they talked about their dreams for other things to do. But when we asked structured questions in the survey about being able to achieve a meaningful existence, having hope, or feeling at home, the scores were very similar to the urban. And so there, our psychosocial and our social scores were really very similar across urban and camp. So what's happening here? Well, why is our qual and quant data telling us different things? And one idea is this idea of adaptive preference from someone called Steve Fuller. There's an explanation here, which is when we bend our aspiration in light of our experience. So we come to want what we think is in our grasp. So it's not just a reality check, It's in disciplining your motivation, your internal motivation with the benefit of hindsight. You know what you're capable of achieving in a camp, so you're going to limit your aspirations. But then we also have to recognize that life in the city can be really isolating, very difficult. And I want to come on to that now with the livelihoods work that is the other component of the research. Our colleagues in Cardiff looking at livelihoods and businesses, the enterprises of refugees and displaced people. So this idea of refugee economies as the collective economy created by refugees through their livelihoods, enterprise, needs for services and consumption, mutual support, and diaspora inputs. So our data shows that there is a higher proportion of refugees earning an income from work in cities and in camps in Ethiopia, Jordan, and Kenya. So we can show this here on this graph, where the people in green, the sort of green bar are people in work, and the red are people out of work, no income from work. And you can see that generally in the cities, there is a higher proportion of people working. Also, another component that our colleagues at Cardiff looked into with our partners was this idea of being work ready. I'm here developing an asset index, which includes price skills, and also financial, physical, and social assets and legal rights to work. And what we found is that that refugees in cities are much more likely to have these assets in Ethiopia and Kenya, but it's less pronounced in Jordan. And men are much, much more likely to hold these assets than women. So here you can see our men and women red and blue. We've got camp on the left in each box chart and urban on the right. And again, you can see that people with greater levels of livelihood assets are the ones in the cities. And you can see the big gender divide coming up again in Kenya. But we do find there's real wasted potential. This is a really important challenge because of three things: rights to work, rights to run a business, and restrictions on mobility. And refugee livelihoods are really curtailed. Many refugees don't work, or they're doing jobs that don't reflect their skills and experience. And that's a really interesting data set that we have. We asked people in the survey, what were you doing before you were displaced? What are you doing now? And we're able to track whether or not people have been able to continue using their skills, education, experience or not, whether displacement has been a shock to that basically livelihoods trajectory. Also for businesses, so refugees and displaced people running enterprises, their growth is constrained because they can't invest, or they have to engage in exploitative partnerships to be able to get around restrictions to be able to register their business. So we found that in Addis and Amman. In Eastleigh, between the Somali refugees and Kenyan Somalis, there are examples we found of quite productive partnerships that allow local businesses to thrive. But I mean, the livelihood vulnerabilities of refugees can be hidden. So while some refugees really are surviving and thriving, others, particularly women-headed households, are extremely vulnerable. And I did say that we had some data on hosts, and we haven't put we haven't talked about the host data today. Again, because they're citizens, they automatically do better on our wellbeing index. We will be able to go back into our data and look at and choose indicators that really are comparable between refugees and hosts around issues of economic wellbeing. But we do find that overall refugees are always doing worse than our host population. So the urban refugees are doing better than the camp, but they're really not doing so well as the urban poor who live around them. So they're doing worse than vulnerable people who are not refugees. So life in the city is better across certain components, but huge vulnerabilities do remain. So return to Jordan. I'm getting near the end of my presentation, I promise. Why are results so similar between Zaatari and Amman? So one issue is people who really want to leave the camp probably have. And so those who've remained are I guess, likely to have come to terms with their lives there. But not all camps are created equal. And the government of Jordan has done a really amazing job in terms of maintaining donor focus on the Syrian crisis and maintaining levels of funding. There's also a great deal of entrepreneurial activity within Zaatari that's quite unusual. There's a flow of goods between the camp and the local area. Some of it's legal, some of it's illicit. But apparently Jordanians sometimes go shopping in Zaatari. So if you're going to spend your life in a camp, Zaatari is probably a good place to do it. I think if we'd done our research in Azraq, those curves would look very, very different. And perhaps the most important point here is the expenditure on Zaatari is huge. And even with that huge expenditure, quality of life for refugees is not higher than it is in Amman. As you saw, those curves were really, really similar. And this level of funding can't go on forever. So we already know that World Food Programme is under a lot of pressure in Jordan, had to reduce cash transfers for urban refugees. For the moment, the camp-based refugees, the cash transfer there is ring-fenced, but there's real concern amongst the government of Jordan and amongst other as donors generally, they're not able to carry on, just the levels of humanitarian aid just aren't available. And it's already a questionable use of aid on spending money on a temporary, expensive and unsustainable intervention in a camp. Zaatari is the newest camp in our study, and we see significant levels of hunger in the other camps that have grown over time. And there's a quote there from somebody in Aseta saying, I don't want to continue this suffering. There's suffering in the camp. And I think this is what's quite challenging, is that the international community is supporting life in camps where we're not even giving people enough to eat. And I guess the question we have to ask ourselves, is this the inevitable path that Zaatari will take as funding levels are reduced? So, some general reflections. The most vulnerable people probably stay in the camps, and I'm sure people are probably gearing up to ask me that question and say, well, some people just can't survive in a camp. And that is true, I'm sure. But we are seeing significant levels of hunger in these camps. And although some people might not be able to make it in the city, are we condemning future generations and making them vulnerable from the start? So if you have a widow, say, with 6 children in Dadaab, yes, it probably will be very difficult for her to survive in Nairobi, but should we be making her children vulnerable in this and dependent in this way? What's the intergenerational impact of people being brought up having their whole lives in a camp? And are we imprisoning future generations and limiting their potential by preventing them from moving or working, but not giving them enough to eat? And then the other message that I want to think about is many refugees are carving out a better life for themselves in cities, despite the policies that are in place that try to prevent this. So we need a fundamental rethink. We need to recognize that we need to help national and city governments recognize the presence of refugees in cities. Not everybody wants to think about it, to be aware of their capacities, aspirations, and their needs. We need to think about working to ensure that humanitarian development funding reaches people on the front lines in cities, and that means city governments. And I think there is real potential there, and Sam and Susan will be talking about that later. It means finding ways to support refugee enterprises with access to finance and removing barriers to registering and running a business. And it means rejecting this narrative that refugees in cities must be self-reliant because we're not giving them any aid. And instead focusing on what it means to live a good life in exile, and one that we would hope for if we to experience displacement. So if you want to know more, we have a project website, protracted-displacement.org. There's also IID's website where there are lots of resources, including the press release and a blog today. And then you can also email me if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I think it was an excellent presentation. There's a lot more to say, as you say. It's only a teaser, basically, because you have a lot of data sets that you still need to exploit. But I think it already gives us that kind of nuance, more granular details about what were our assumptions before your study. So thanks a lot for that. I can see people have already raised their hands. What I would suggest, however, is that we go with the other panelists and then we open up for the Q&A. Next on my list is Simon Marat. You are with us. Yes, I can see you there. You're from South Sudan. You fled to Uganda about 20 years ago and managed to get a scholarship to access higher education. And you have in return worked hard to support the youth in refugee settlements and have co-founded the African Youth Action Network, which is a youth-led organization aims at building peace in war-affected regions. And now you're based in Kampala, and I think that's a place where Lucy and her team would be very much interested to go and collect data and start working there as well. So you know everything about the daily challenges that refugees face in cities, and you have very interesting ideas about how they should work with local authorities on that issue. The floor is yours, Simon. We can't hear you, Simon.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I will talk briefly about the challenges that refugees in urban areas actually face. I know there are plenty of them, and if I'm to talk about them, I can actually take the whole session and even like the whole of this afternoon. So I will pick like few that I see are really very relevant and I think that actually need focus in our session and also going forward. So the first thing is misinformation. So when refugees actually do not know where to go and get the right information from, whether when they are in the city, where do they go actually to get maybe to register their businesses? Where do they go to register their organizations? It becomes very hard for them to actually integrate in the local communities and actually get services that are very relevant to them. For example, they are overcharged to register a business when someone is in Kampala. You will maybe get a local community member who will tell you that I know how to register a business, let me register on your behalf. So they will charge you maybe double or triple or even like 100 times more than what you actually were supposed to actually pay for a business. So that makes life very hard for the local businesses that are run by refugees. So they end up maybe in the informal sector where they are not registered, and then they are overtaxed, and then they're exploited by the people that know that they actually don't have the papers, and then they will tell them, you know what, we are taxing, we are here on behalf of the KCCA, which is the Kampala City Authority. So this time, this makes it very hard for them to actually run their businesses. The other thing I think is also mentioned in the research is survival in the urban areas is really very hard in terms of getting food, in terms of getting shelter, in terms of getting medication. Even the urban schools, the schools that are actually here that are run by the government, that they will tell you that they are free. You need to buy a uniform for your child. You need to actually pay development fee for your child. And just the price of uniform alone in Kampala is actually more than what a secondary school student can actually pay in a refugee camp. So people have to fight for their food, they have to fight for their medication, they have to fight for the school fees for their children here in Kampala. So living here is really hard. So you end up actually taking up jobs that you are actually not paid very well on, or you actually overwork. You work maybe as a cleaner at someone's house, then you end up going home around midnight or around 11 a.m. 11 p.m. actually at night, which is really very, very hard and actually makes life for the refugees really very, very tough here. The other thing on the shelter, you know, like we have migrants that are not refugees here. We have refugees that are actually staying in the urban area. So someone from South Sudan who is a migrant, maybe who has come to look for better school, better medication for their children, they might be having the money and they're able to actually rent houses in a very expensive suburb in Kampala here. So when a refugee from South Sudan actually also comes and say they also want to rent maybe here in Kampala, or maybe you're from Congo or you're from Somalia, they will tell you, you guys have the money. Your colleagues are here spending lavishly in Kampala, so you guys have the money. So it's very hard to actually differentiate between a refugee and a migrant who is not actually a refugee in Kampala here, or who's actually legally staying in Kampala here, maybe with the right document or with the right papers. So that makes it even hard for the refugees to actually get where to actually stay. They are overcharged because they will tell them, no, you are a Congolese. Congolese actually have gold in their area. You are a Somali. Somalis are the one running businesses in most part of Africa. So they overcharge them. The other thing is that refugees that are actually in Kampala are the one that we focus on. But refugees who are also in other small cities like Gulu, they are in Koboko, they are in Arua town, they are in Barara city. They are not actually considered in the data that we're actually collecting as humanitarian, or the intervention that are actually given, the little intervention I would say, because refugees in urban cities are not actually supposed to be doing anything by the humanitarian organization. They are assumed to be self-reliant. They are supposed to survive on their own. So whether you're working or you're not working, it is not actually the business of all the humanitarian organizations. But even the little focus now that is given to urban refugees, it is not even given to those who are in Arua, in Gulu, in Koboko. So maybe going forward, we also need to make sure that these people also are part of our discussion, and we make sure that they actually are given the right support that they need. Then the last thing, which may be a challenge that I also want to talk about, is on documentation. You know, when you don't have an ID, you cannot actually transact, you cannot actually move freely, you cannot do anything, whether in the bank, you cannot get services in school, you cannot actually register your child. And then the other thing is that refugee households don't even know where to actually have their maybe children, the birth certificate for the children. So someone might have actually given birth in a health center, let's say Mengo Hospital, but then you are not given the certificate from Mengo Hospital. You have to go to maybe Rubaga KCC offices, or you have to go to near offices in Kawempe, in Makindi. And when you don't know these offices as a refugee, you will end up not getting a birth certificate for your child. And when you don't have a birth certificate for your child will not enroll in school. if you want to maybe go for vaccination, they need that certificate. So it's very hard for refugees who don't have the right documentation to actually get services in a city like Kampala. Also on documentation, when you don't have the right IDs, you cannot register your business because they will ask you, okay, what is your business? What is your ID? Who are you? Are you a foreigner from South Sudan or a foreigner from Somalia? Why are you here? Why are you registering? Are you supposed to also be getting the same services like a host community? So these are the questions that actually we get when we actually interact with some of the offices that we go to in Kampala. So IDs, conventional travel document, attestations are things that are really very important. They're actually like life, the refugees. And some offices actually don't recognize them. You can have the refugee ID, but they will tell you need to get a recommendation from Office of the Prime Minister so that we know it's a real ID. Or if you have the attestation, they will tell you, give us the attestation, give us the refugee ID, and also a recommendation. But for you to also get that recommendation, it will take you a week or like 2 to 3 weeks for you to get that recommendation. Now, assuming you want to actually get registered or you want to get the services that is urgent, and you have to wait for 2 weeks, how is that going to be affecting you psychologically? How are you going to be affected financially? How are you going to be affected actually physically? Because you have to be in this office every day to remind people that, you know what, I need this, it's really very, very important. So I'll give you like some few recommendations that I think if maybe we put 1 or 2 into practice can actually be very good for the work that the host communities and the city authorities can actually do with the refugees. So the first thing is that we need to actually have the private sector educated on the rights and the values of refugees. A country like Uganda has a very good policy. They say refugees actually have the right to work. You don't need, if you're a refugee, you don't need a work permit to work in Uganda. But when I go to the private sector, let's say a bank or maybe a company, and I ask them like, I need to be employed, they will tell you, where is your work permit? When I tell them, no, I don't need a work permit because I'm a refugee here, they will tell you, no. For us, we need people who have the work permit. Go and get us a work permit. Now, when you go to the office of the Prime Minister, they will tell you, you don't need a work permit. So now you are left in between. The private sector doesn't want to employ you because you don't have a work permit. The offices are telling you don't need a work permit because it is written in the policy. So where is the gap? I think this is where now the city authorities can actually come in their meetings with the private sector and tell them, you know what, refugees, if they are coming to actually get employment in your premises, and someone has got a skill, a required skill, in that department that you are working in, at least employ them because they don't need actually a work permit to work in Uganda. The second thing is we can automate some of the work that we do. For example, the Uganda Registration Service Bureau automated the process of getting a recommendation letter from them for you to open a bank account for a business or for a company that is limited by a guarantee. So if you want to open an account, you just go pay Uganda shilling 20,000, you scan your document, and then send the resolution, which is scanned also, to their website. And then within a day, you are able to actually get back the feedback, and then also like a signed copy of your resolution, which you just take to the bank, and then the bank can actually work on you. So if some of the services that the city authorities actually are able to actually run, for example, the taxes that the small businesses are actually paying for refugees, or maybe registering resident in an area, if they are able to be maybe automated, I don't need to go to an office, or crowd an office. I can actually do it maybe where possible. If I have a friend who has a smartphone, I have a friend who has maybe an internet cafe, and I can just do it online and have the services that I actually need. The other thing is we can actually have monthly sessions, monthly, weekly, or weekly sessions on information that are vital to refugees. How do you register a business? How do you pay, like file your returns if you're a refugee running a business in Kampala? How do you also access some of these offices? This information is very important. If we can actually, some of these things are already there, like the Uganda Revenue Authority do have this session, like every 2 months, they do have this session, but they are not tailored to the different needs of the refugees or the people who are actually running businesses and actually are refugees in the cities. So if we can tailor them to the needs of refugees so that we can actually have them in their local languages, we can actually have them in languages that they actually understand, or we have people who can actually interpret some of these things for them. And then chances are very high that the misinformation that we have in the city can actually be reduced and refugees can actually get services that are very good. The fourth thing is on the city officials. When I go to an office, I need to be received by someone who is actually maybe smiling at me and telling me, you know what, okay, how do I actually support you? Not someone who will be asking me, why are you here? Why should that be the first question? So if city officials are not actually, if they are not welcoming, if the work environment are not conducive, well, we'll stay away from them. And when refugees are staying away from them, it means they will not open up. Even if you go to their offices, they will not open up. If you are all the time quiet and just looking at someone in a certain way, refugees will not open up. At least when you are there, give that someone an audience. I will give you an example.
Simon, can I ask you to conclude very soon, please?
So if I will give an example, there was a city official in Makere Chikonebi. She was very welcoming during the COVID-19 lockdown. They were distributing food. Then we told her, you know what, for us, we're not entitled to this food because it's for host community. She said, no, this COVID-19 does not discriminate. All of us are dying regardless of our status. This food is for you. And then she included us in the weekly session for our Makere Chikonebi. So we got the information about when the meetings are run, where the meetings are run, and what we are discussed, the security situation that are discussed in Makere Chikonebi. We became so much integrated. Those are the things that we really need to see from the city officials. If they can actually integrate people from the village level to the parish level until maybe the municipal level. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you so much. It was very good to hear, first-hand information from you, and in particular, we really appreciated the recommendation, very pragmatic recommendation, basically targeting city officials and how they can help fill the gaps. Thank you so much. I'm now turning to Susan. Susan, you're with us. Susan Kimani, you work at the Youth Affairs Department of the Nairobi County City Government. So the city of Nairobi is home to many refugees, we all know that, and asylum seekers who originate mainly from Somalia and South Sudan, but also other countries. You'll tell us what your city government has decided to do to really foster cohesion at the local level. The floor is yours, Susan. You have 5 to 7 minutes.
All right. Oh, sorry. All right. Thank you. Thank you. And it's really great to be here, and also to from what Marot has said, I think I can just say, really, it is a privilege to be talking about the plight of the refugees within the city. But I'm going to talk about Nairobi and what we are doing in Nairobi and how far we've gone. We've experienced these interactions with the refugees, and we have been able to see some of the challenges, and to interact with them means we have been able to hear and even see the challenges that they are going through. It seems like Kampala and Nairobi are almost the same. But in Nairobi, as we see, there's so many, I would say that like 80,000, we have about 80,000 refugees in Nairobi. And this means that there are so many urban refugees within Nairobi, within the city, unlike those who are even looking at those who are in Kakuma, in the settlements and all that, in Kakuma and Dadaab. And when we are looking at that, we ask ourselves, where have we come from? Where has Nairobi come from? Nairobi has come from a situation whereby the encampment policy had restricted the refugees into the camps and the settlements, and therefore meaning that the humanitarian help and the government access to the ones that are coming to the city were not able to access to the government services per se. In terms of being documented, they went without the services, and actually they were not able to get the humanitarian, support. So we are coming from that situation whereby in the 90s that the issue of encampment policy was enforced due to the pressures that Nairobi was going through, or the Kenyan government was going through. But we are grateful to the previous government, or rather because we're in a new dispensation that came up, that has actually worked along with the refugees in terms of the protocols that have been there in place in terms of the eastern region, and even in the UN, UNHCR, in the UN agencies to tackle the issue of refugees. And in that journey, Kenya came up with the Refugee Act 2021. Where, I think the 2021 Act has really changed things in Nairobi, meaning that at this moment, there are benefits that we are getting from the Refugee Act 2021, which actually provides for the right for documentation of all refugees, inclusive of those ones in the city, and also access to government services, and looking like education and health and all that. And also looking at some of the provisions whereby now they can access, licensing to businesses, whereby now they are more included in the socio-economic development of the city. And, we are in that stage whereby the city is trying to understand and to try to, to assimilate that act and be able to actualize it. And that is where we are at in terms of just getting to see the local government being able to understand the refugee issue. It's a new phenomenon to them, and because it was actually being handled by the national government, now trickling down through the act to the local government, it's where we are at in terms of the initiatives that have been started on, in terms of partnerships that have come on board, in terms of NGOs, non-governmental organizations that have come on board to actually sensitize the county government on matters refugees. Some of the initiatives that we have come up with are, just sensitizing the local authority officials on the Refugee Act, just to understand it, so that they're able to deal with the issues of the refugees within the city. And we have also seen previously, because last year we had the general elections in the city. One of the ways we decided as the youth department, we interact a lot with young people, and we actually do not label them, because whether you are a refugee or not a refugee, or you are in the host community, we actually do not label you, because you are a young person and you need the service. So we realized that in our midst, there were those. Now, at that point, we had to get intentionally work with the refugees so that they are able to tell the stories of where they are coming from, so that even as we go through the elections, and even after the elections, then how can we, have a cohesive community in terms of the non-violence, post-election violence, like we have always had in the past. And having involved the refugees was really a lesson for the host communities, especially their stories that were very, moving, in terms of just understanding that we are coming from a place of war. We do not want this country to go to that space. But at the same time, looking at other initiatives that have come about is looking at how the youth department has pushed for the city to take up issues in terms of planning, the issue of the county development plans that are coming on board. Like, for instance, we have the new dispensation where we have a county integrated plan that is actually done every 5 years. And now we are at the beginning of a dispensation of a new government, which will run for the next 5 years. And so we have actually had, joint implementation plans and the items, or rather issues of refugees, are really being pushed to be in that plan, meaning that moving forward for the next 5 years, then we shall be having this, these issues being tackled, or the services being given, by the city government, or rather even budgeting, like budgeting for services for the residents of the city, meaning that we can also include the refugees who also benefit from the services that will be given to the city. In this endeavor, we have seen partnerships from different organizations like the IIAD. We have also seen the Mayor's Migration Council. We have seen the SDI and other local, and especially, like, also we have seen a push also from the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, which actually pushed an implementation plan that actually we are still working on, to be integrated into the development plan, the 5-year 2022 to 2027 plan for the county. And a memoranda has been given to the city to be able to look into the issues that actually may be left out in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the systems that really the city needs to improve, in terms of the services that are to be given to the refugees, or rather to the host communities. While on it, we are looking at why are we pushing these plans, or rather issues, into the development plan of the city. That is the only way that the city can pick up, and looking at how we can even lobby even into the National Assembly, or not the County Assembly, where we look at the legislators being able to understand the refugees and how they are impacted in their own constituencies. and how they can get services in their own constituencies. At times, it's not easy for them to understand, so how do I get a vote from a refugee? But then after discussing, then we are able to, to let them see how that, refugees given a service will also contribute to the development of the constituency. And so really understanding that there need to be a cohesive constituency, even for them to move forward in terms of them being the representative of the residents within their constituency. So really, we have had a talk with the legislators, we have had a talk with the administrators, we have had a talk with the county staff, being able to, and this is ongoing because it's part of the development plan in terms of sensitization, creation of awareness, so that we now are able to understand it more. I really understand that moving forward, looking at how the ideal situation that we are looking at is we are looking at a situation where Nairobi, as a local, city, or as a city, will be able to assimilate and integrate, refugees together with the host communities in their systems and in their development plans, so that we are able to give services to the 5 million plus residents within the city. So that is our ideal future. Looking at our ideal future, in fact, even looking at the joint partnerships that we have been creating within different players within this sector, in terms of research, in terms of even livelihoods. So we are looking at how then do we shoulder, come up with this burden that the city is receiving daily. How then, considering that maybe the city may not be able to take up everything. So we are pulling and attracting all the players in the field, so that we are able to shoulder this issue and be able to work with it in terms of partnerships, in terms of providing services to the residents of the city. And I think that is the far I would go in terms of just giving you an overview of what Nairobi has done, and so far so good, because we are still in the beginning of the county development plan, and I see it taking us to the next 5 years, having assimilated. The governor's pillar is about the dignity, a city of dignity, a city of order, and inclusion. Meaning, inclusion is everyone. No one is being left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Zan. It's great to hear you talking about this with so much enthusiasm, and it really shows how a city basically can take, all its population, including refugees, IDPs, as opportunities, for positive economic and social outcomes for the city as such. Sounds like Nairobi is a good example to be basically shared tomorrow during the High Commissioner Dialogue on Protection Challenges, which will focus on development cooperation. So it sounds like a very good example to share with other cities at least. Thanks a lot for that. And last but not least, I have Summer Saliba with us. You are the head of practice at the Mayor's Migration Council, and you actually have also been involved in the IID project led by Lucy and her team as a technical advisor. In particular, you focus on the participatory planning component of the project, and you will be launching a policy brief today. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Antu, and thank you for having me, and to my fellow panelists for doing the tremendous work that you're all doing. And I think we all got a sense of that today. So yeah, on behalf of the Mayor's Migration Council and my colleagues / co-authors, Anna Welnicki of IIED and Nassim Majidi of Samuel Hall, I'm pleased today to launch the Protracted Displacement in an Urban World policy brief on city planning with displaced communities. I would say that there are some copies in the room, but Lucy was supposed to bring them with her. So we'll all have to just go online and download that when we get back to our computers. But what we've highlighted, and what Lucy so well highlighted in her presentation about what we've learned from PDUW, is that we cannot say that people affected by displacement are more likely to be better off in cities than in camps, full stop. But what we can say with some confidence, I'll add, is that people affected by displacement feel that they have a better chance at well-being in cities than in camps. And I often say refugees go to camps for safety, but they go to cities for opportunity. So the question then becomes, how do we take advantage of this opportunity, and who is best placed to do so? The answer we make in our the case for in our policy brief, the answer is city governments. But the answer is also refugee communities themselves. And I think Susan and Simon Morrow have proven this in their remarks. But to add further evidence, the PDUW project held participatory forums in the cities where we're working, Amman, Addis Ababa, Jalalabad, and Nairobi, with a principal ambition to create spaces where displaced groups can voice their needs and goals and collaborate with others to co-develop inclusive practical solutions, including and especially with city governments. Our participatory planning forums in Amman, Addis, of course, Nairobi, but even in Jalalabad have shown the benefit of including refugee communities in shaping, and IDP communities in the case of Jalalabad, in shaping the inclusivity of each city. And we have examples of what's resulted, right? In Nairobi, the participatory forums are bringing refugee perspectives into citywide plans for the first time ever. Susan talked at length about the County Integrated Development Plan and how refugees will be included within the next 5 years of planning for the county government. But even in Jalalabad, the municipal administration has agreed to use the data to develop a citywide plan to support the well-being of both IDPs and long-standing city residents. And that includes approaches to promoting women and girls' well-being, whose well-being our research have found from the physical and social welfare point of view is less than that of their male counterparts. So these forums in these 4 cities are fantastic. They're doing great work, but they also represent the as of yet untapped potential of many city governments and communities affected by displacement, working hand in hand to make cities more inclusive of refugees, IDPs, and more conducive, most importantly, to their self-reliance, their well-being, and their agency. And they also represent the beneficial role that international humanitarian actors can play in nurturing these connections and investing in cities and refugee communities rather than perpetuating camp-based approaches to displacement. Here's where I get a bit opinionated. Yes, camps save lives, but saving lives is not enough. We need to do more to amplify the agency of displaced communities to be active agents of change in the cities that they are choosing to call home. This will take international humanitarian community moving beyond camps to start investing in cities and participatory inclusive processes that promote urban well-being. For our part at the Mayor's Migration Council, we have our Global Cities Fund for Migrants and Refugees, which puts money directly in the hands of city governments to implement projects of their own design in partnership with migrant and refugee communities. And I'm pleased to say that Nairobi and Governor Sakaja is a grantee, one of our newest grantees of the Global Cities Fund. But we need more collaboration between international humanitarian actors, donors, city governments, local NGOs, and community leaders to best address displacement through agile funding and through long-term participatory development planning in cities. I really encourage you all to go to the link that is shared in the chat for those of you online to download the latest research from Protracted Displacement in an Urban World, and also invite you all to continue to work with us on the research side, but also on the action side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samir. You've said it all. I've got nothing to add. Thank you so much for that. And I think you raised a very important point about funding, direct funding for cities, basically, to better integrate and include refugees and IDPs in their development plans. I think this is something that is very key and that NMC is doing fantastically well. There are loads of questions in the Q&A box. I would encourage panelists to have a look at them and to try to answer a few of them which are specific to their basically presentations. But meanwhile, I'm turning here to the room to see whether there are questions, comments that you would like to share, and please introduce yourself.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Rula El-Rifai.
Yeah, I think just to make sure that people can hear you.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Rula El-Rifai, and I'm with Canada's International Development Research Center. We are a corporation that funds research in developing countries, and I'm here with my colleague, and we're working on, we are here for the HCD, and this was a fantastic opportunity and surprise to hear the report. We are working on the issue of localization and forced displacement and localization of research and knowledge. So this is all very well connected. So my questions, and I'm really looking forward to reading the report. A couple of questions that immediately come to mind. One of them is there in the study some kind of a refugee community self-definition of what well-being and livelihoods is? Bringing in factors such as the ability to organize and be more representative, having your own institutions and refugee-led organizations, the issue of legal status and its complexity of having right to work versus right to education versus actual status as a refugee, the context itself that is more centralized and less centralized, that allows more freedom of expression or not. So I'm just wondering if there's a correlation between the findings and if there's room to correlate the findings to some of these really other important contextual factors that would be really interesting, including the issue of social cohesion and relationship to host community. And then maybe one question that immediately comes to mind, we talk a lot about cities and urban settings, and immediately makes me think about rural settings. And in Canada, we've got this fantastic model of private sponsorships of refugee communities. And anecdotal and research that's coming out says a lot about the success of the integration and the better well-being of refugees in rural communities rather than in urban centers, even though there's similar indicators. So it's interesting. I wonder if at some point we don't get into the counter to the urban development and focus on rural development. But thank you so much, and I look forward to the report findings.
Thank you so much. Lucy, you want to give it a try for the first question, or your colleagues, I don't know, who are online, about the definition of well-being, basically in correlation with the context. If you want to give it a try with that one.
Yes, and thank you, Ruda, for your questions. I should say, first of all, that there isn't just going to be one report. So this is a 3-year project. Well, actually, it's extended to nearly 4 years. There'll be multiple reports coming out across, focusing on the different countries and focusing on the different themes. So today we just have one policy brief. It's our first official publication, and colleagues' work on the participatory element of the research of the short policy brief. But we'll be bringing out working papers for each country, looking at the data from each country. There'll be policy briefs from each country, and then we're going to be bringing out thematic papers around issues of well-being, livelihoods and economies, around issues of self-reliance, and the gendered analysis that we're also doing at the moment on our data. So over the next year, there's going to be we'll have a whole communications campaign where we're going to be doing media work around the more salient findings, and then for people who are really interested in the details, we're going to be producing working papers and academic articles at the end of the project as well. So is there a refugee definition of well-being? Well, that was always the intention of the research, and we had very well laid plans to do some quite in-depth participatory work with refugees on the meaning of well-being. Unfortunately, we started this project in February 2020, and we all, well, in Europe, March 18th, which was 8 days after our inception meeting in London, was when we were shut down, and other countries went into lockdown sooner than that, actually. And then we really had to pivot the way we were able to do our work. So where we could, we had focus groups about the meaning of well-being. But by that point, we'd had to carry on with the design of our survey. And so we've actually just put together a proposal for kind of some follow-up, where we'll go back, and we want to go back and ask the refugees who are involved in our survey, this is what we found from our research on well-being, livelihood, self-reliance. Does this reflect your life? So you want to do that in groups. You also want to do it with individuals, be able to contact individuals who are willing to speak with us again and tell them what we found from their data, and ask them, well, why do you think you score highly on this or low on this? So yes, there's a whole plan to sort of go back and really ground this in working with refugee communities to understand if we're asking the right questions, we're painting an accurate picture, have we defined these concepts right, have we used the language right, because I showed you those slide with the different translations, but we really need to check that we are asking the questions in the right way in all those different languages. So yes, we're getting there and an understanding from the refugee perspective or the displaced people's perspective what well-being is, but there's more work to be done, and this is just the first phase. I think in terms of the context, the policy context is different in each of those countries, and that's something we will be looking into in our in the working papers that we'll look at the data from each country. And I think that is very important. It is mainly a comparison, as I said, between the camp and the urban within each country, rather than across countries. But I think there is something to be learned from where countries are more progressive in practice or in theory, and what the outcomes of that are. And on the question of social cohesion, yes, we have got some, I hope, fantastic data on that, and perhaps my colleagues online will be able to come in, but we did specifically ask questions around discrimination, about socializing with people who are different to you, about working with, if you're displaced, working with non-displaced people, business owners, whether they hire local citizens as opposed to other refugees or a mixture. We've got lots and lots of data on that, and the real ability to dig into that further. So I'll leave it there, I think, and I don't know if other people colleagues online want to jump in, or or my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Lucy. I don't see anyone jumping in. On the question of the rural areas, I'm definitely not qualified to respond to that. I was wondering if maybe Susan wanted to respond to that. For instance, I know you only work maybe for the Nairobi city government, but have you heard about other initiatives in rural areas as well to better include refugees?
I've not interacted much with the rural settings, but I know that there are very few initiatives that have been launched in the rural areas, but also looking at how the refugees are coming in and integrating themselves, or rather, in terms of looking for employment. I see a lot of them moving towards the rural in terms of their livelihoods, bettering their livelihoods. And you find that in many rural homes where they're able to employ handymen, and house helps, you find that they will also get them to work, but I see they also have their own challenges in terms of communication, in terms of maybe even sending money home, in terms of even receiving money, and they have their own challenges, and they have really to work together with the locals. But I think that is also the beauty of it, that the locals are also very ready to help, but they have also ran through some hurdles in terms of those who have taken away their monies. So in terms of helping them, so you realize that there is that there's a kind of they're taken advantage of because they're not able to send money home or receive money from different areas, and they have to use especially the mobile, the phones. In terms of the mobile money, they have no local.
Oh, wait, we lost you, Susan. We'll go back to you, Susan. Sorry, we really lost the sound. I was just wondering, I saw earlier people raised hands. That's not the case anymore, but I think there were people from the IOM, if I'm not mistaken, who had raised their hands. Yes, I've seen that as well. I just want to make sure. I think there was Cecilia somewhere before, but it's not the case anymore. All right. Simon, you wanted to add to that. Please take the floor, Simon. Unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I want to reply and add on the issue about rural refugees actually integrating much better than those who are in urban. Yeah, because I would say 15 years of my life I was in Mbefi refugee settlement, which is like a rural area in a rural district, like northern part of Uganda. So the most interesting part is that refugees mostly actually settle in areas where the host communities actually have much more relationship with them. For example, in Palabek, the South Sudanese who are there are Acholis, and the people who are in Palabek town are also like Acholis. And then people who are in Arua district, the Congolese are the ones which are from the neighboring eastern part of Congo, which also speak the local languages. And then the people who are in Bidi, mostly the Kakwa is speaking from South Sudan. So you'll find that the host communities actually and the refugees speak the same language. So if you want to go and get maybe a services like land, you can actually go and borrow land from the host communities. They will tell you, okay, fine, we're going to give you land for 1 year for you to actually dig and actually farm there and maybe like grow something for your own family. So it's very easy because the host and the refugees actually look at themselves as people who have the same background, they have the same cultures, and they have the same challenges. And also like the economic situation or the livelihood situation of the host urban, the host the rural communities in the host communities, they're really struggling. They're also suffering like refugees. So when they see refugees coming and actually interacting with them, they are like people who actually have the same challenges. So it is much easier, I think I would say, to integrate in the refugee camp or in the refugee settlement than when you are in the urban here, because the economic inequalities are much greater in the urban than in the settlements. But in the settlements, the challenges are really very much because there are no structures there. We don't have infrastructures there that are things to do with financial services, things to do with work, things to do with like internet connectivity and all these things. They're really also challenging that side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I can see there are loads of very interesting questions in the Q&A box. I don't think we'll have time to answer all of them, but one is about the tension between central and local government priorities, which doesn't seem to be the case as we've heard in Nairobi, but that might be the case in other countries. So if one of the panelists want to take that point, and the question about inclusion and integration differences and outcomes in small cities and big ones. That is also another point that the question is raised in the resettlement context, but I think it applies to any context. If one of the panelists want to take that point, I'm talking about questions by Dave Waters and Vincent Cochetel. Lucy?
Thanks. I can have a go at the question about the tensions between national and city government. And I think I'd start off by questioning whether or not it's a problem, which I think is how the question is phrased. In many countries, including my own, there's actually sort of progressive mayors who want to do something different to the national level government and who find the policies of their national government to be unhelpful or in some cases, possibly even illegal, right? And I think we see this in Europe, we see it in the US, where there are networks of cities, like city leaders, sticking their necks out and saying, actually, we see the benefit of having refugees here. It's not just about bleeding hearts. It's also about investment. It's about new people coming in with new ideas, new skills. We're open to refugees. Our doors are open. I know that a lot of people in the network and the platform that the Mayor's Migration Council would take that approach. So I don't think it necessarily has to be seen as a tension. I think you can get, you can actually sort of bring about changes in policy from, if you're sort of an active group of mayors in a country, you can have influence on the national stage. And I think that we should be sort of looking at city leadership there as a positive. So that's a sort of glass half full. I want to hand over to Sam now, and I'll have much more to say on that one.
Thank you, Lucy. That's already a good answer. Samir, sorry, you wanted to take the floor.
Just really quickly on the national government, city government relationship, and also the smaller cities questions. Yeah, I mean, I'm increasingly starting to frame it as national governments are either with cities or against cities. There's not much they can do to prevent cities from helping migrants and refugees, but they can do a lot to actually further that work, to create an enabling environment and to create the conditions, especially the policy conditions, for cities to thrive in the work that they're already doing. Other than that, it's more about closing borders and just simply making it harder, but actually stopping positive actions is very hard to do. And I think I really want to thank SDC's remarks for celebrating the work of cities and the other donors of the Mayor's Migration Council for recognizing the leadership of mayors around the world in elevating this voice and actually taking a more positive stance than what we're seeing from time to time from some national governments, not all. On the smaller cities versus larger cities, I actually get this question a lot. And to use this phrase, size doesn't matter, really. It's more about the programs that the cities are implementing for the Global Cities Fund And we have 21 city projects now. We have large cities like Nairobi that are doing tremendous work, or Medellin that's doing tremendous work providing temporary housing for migrants and refugees. But we also just added Nyamagabe district, which if you've heard of it in the room, please raise your hand, because I hadn't heard of it before they applied to the Global Cities Fund. But it's a small district in Rwanda of 300,000 people in the district total, and the town is much smaller, but there's a refugee camp nearby to the town. And Mayor Hildebrand there is working to actually generate, to use the waste from that refugee camp to generate more clean energy for both the camp and the nearby town. And that's a strong, big example from a very small city. So there's a lot of work, big or small, that cities can do and are continuing to do.
Great, thanks for that, Samer. I like your point about size doesn't matter. Are there any other comments in the room? Yes, please, if you could introduce yourself.
Carrie Diener. Amongst the panelists as well. We're co-convening, presenting on it, the High Commissioner's Dialogue in a couple of days on self-reliance topics. And I just was really thrilled to see some of the recommendations coming out around support to municipal officials, because that's something that came out of our discussions and the brainstorming that will lead into some recommendations for a roadmap to the Global Refugee Forum pledging processes. And so we also saw a lot of recommendations around local development plans, support to municipalities as one of the really key things that hasn't really been tapped yet in terms of pledges and support. So I was really thrilled to see that. I'm interested in understanding what types of specific policy recommendations you might make in terms of national level policies that can help support at the local level, because that's something that I'd like to get a little bit more granular about as we develop our roadmap out further. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any panelists that want to take this question? Sorry, yes, the microphone is working. I know, I hope there are some states. We have one of them in the room, Switzerland, of course, but we have other, I think, states in the audience to this event. Is there anyone wanting to take the point about national support to local government? Summer, again, I think.
Yes, sorry to come in right after speaking, but I do think it's so important exactly how national governments can create a policy space and join, and creating a space where city governments can join them hand in hand in doing things like delivering on the global compacts for migration and on refugees. We work hand in hand with UNHCR, IOM, UCLG in something called the Call to Local Action, which elevates the pledges of city governments to implement the global compacts, which of course are endorsed by national governments. And what I want to call out specifically is Colombia, where we have 3 cities, Barranquilla, Medellin, and Bogota, all making pledges as a part of the Call to Local Action, but also implementing projects of the Global Cities Fund. And what's happening, especially in places like Medellin, is that they are the implementing arm of national policies such as the right to work and the right to legal stay for Venezuelan migrants within Colombia. So the national government has set up the policy, but actually all 3 cities are actually helping implement that policy within these 3 cities. And what's happening is that the actual translation of the policy or application of the policy is happening within the city. I can also give the example, if I may, Susan, of the groundbreaking work, let me call it, in Nairobi, where we all know that Kenya has an encampment policy, but there is conversations about opening up registration sites for refugees to register within Nairobi, which would be, in my opinion, really such a huge change that many of us have been fighting for decades in some cases within Kenya. So that's some of the examples of how that policy space can actually really translate at the local level, and how city governments can be the implementing arm of those policies, and the benefits that come from national governments and city governments being on the same page.
Thanks, Summer. Lucy?
Yeah, I think one of the points I would make about the sort of the policy space and the relationship between the national and the city government is sort of a greater recognition on the part of national government on the ways in which an increase in your city population is going to have significant impacts. In refugee crises or a lot of internal displacement crises, the population of a municipality could double or treble. And yet that, as the people who've arrived are not registered locally, they might be from a different district or they're in a different country, they're not sort of counted as part of the population. And then in many cases, this means that the funding made available from the national government and city government for basic urban services, it's just not there. And so you have a city government struggling with a population that's doubled or trebled with no additional resources from the centre. And there's some really interesting work that Cities Alliance has done on this, actually, looking at how you might improve sort of the census data so that you recognise that if you're Aurora, for example, and you've got a refugee camp next door, there are probably a lot of refugees who are living in the city and who need to be counted, recognised, so that there's an adequate level of service provision. So I think breaking down the barriers, the labelling barriers, and somebody put that in the chat that it's problematic when academics or others start trying to talk about removing labels. But actually, if we start thinking about city residents, we may help to improve service provision and protection for some vulnerable space.
Thank you for that, Lucy. Any other points? Yes.
I think that will be one of the last questions. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting topic. I'm Hind Al-Shobaki, and I am a researcher from the University of Applied Sciences and Art from Northwestern Switzerland. My question is about the case of Jordan, because actually I am a Jordanian and I touch the reality of the refugee camps and I discussed them in different publications. My question is about the Palestinian refugees. Are they included in the study or not? Because it is like a different kind of camps there, because they are kind of protracted refugees, and it is the kind of the camp within the city. So because of the urban expansion, the camp, which was like on the edge of the city, it's become part of the urban tissue. So the questions of the study, which are so interesting, are they reflected to the case of the Palestinians or no? Thank you.
Thank you. And indeed, the project is called Protracted Displacement. So I think the case of Palestinian is definitely one that is protracted. Lucy, you want to provide an answer to that one? And then we'll be close.
I'm afraid the answer is no, they're not in this case. We just take one nationality refugee per country. That's all we're able to do, unfortunately. But we, as I mentioned, we want to expand this project and think about how we can encourage people to think about well-being of protracted displacement and move beyond sort of these vulnerability assessment frameworks are quite limiting in the types of data that they collect. I mean, I also want to say that perhaps that we do need to look at the Palestinian question, because we need to learn from history about what happens to camps over time and how they can become places of exclusion in the long term, where they sort of morph slowly into informal settlements where there can be a lot of problems of service provision. And I think the problems of the Palestinian camps is a lesson from history that hasn't been learned. And I think that's something that we need to factor into some of our broader messages related to other research that II is doing on the costs of camps. And we're talking about economic costs, also talking about the human costs of camps, and actually thinking right from the start, can we avoid creating camps, knowing how the situation may play out in future. But that's for next year. So that's our World Without Camps campaign that you'll be hearing more from IID on next year.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you to all panelists. It was a fascinating discussion, honestly. It was great to hear, granular details about the findings, and we're looking forward to hearing more about it. You said there would be follow-up in that regard. We're also looking forward, I think, to hear more about what's next after that study. How does that apply to operational programs, by humanitarian actors, by development actors in the field? I think that would be important to translate your findings as well into something that is operational to those actors who are assisting and protecting refugees, IDPs, but also maybe migrants, and to enlarge the categories. One thing that we've heard again and again is the space that is needed for municipalities, municipal city officials, basically to take part in the debate, to be part of the thinking, to have this dialogue with national authorities. That is something that MMC is working for, very efficiently. Other actors as well. We heard about, when you have enlightened city governments, what they can do basically to really include those vulnerable categories of people in their development plans. So we would really encourage states who are listening to us to basically take into account their cities and local authorities in general into the discussion, so that they can be more, joint development planning. Thanks a lot to everyone. Lucy, can I ask you maybe one last point about, just to tell us exactly what's next? Sorry, it's not that a short question, but just to give us a hint, and maybe can come back to you.
So what's next is, over the course of the next year, there's going to be a lot of publications coming out that you'll be able to see on the IID website, but also on our project website. Apologies, there's a lot of background noise behind me. It's lunchtime where I am. We'll be releasing working papers on each of the 4 countries and policy briefs. We will also be, as I mentioned, there'll be a communications campaign where we'll have media stories coming out, hopefully also photo stories and using films as telling the stories and experiences of refugees. We are thinking about how we might develop this work further. As we've mentioned, we think there's a gap in Uganda in terms of that Simon Moreau pointed to, the questions in Kampala around understanding the challenges and sort of trying to get over some of those challenges to the well-being and livelihoods of refugees. We think that we'd like to do more work with the international community to understand refugee well-being and to start making that something that we use to inform our programming. And so basically, I think you have to watch the space, and we'll be perhaps looking to come back to Geneva, hopefully getting on a plane next time, which I unfortunately didn't manage to do last night, and perhaps to present in more detail at Humanitarian Partnerships Week next year, for example. So please look out for us, and I think if possible we will send the policy brief and the blog that I mentioned out to everyone who registered for the event, so that they're aware of where they can find out more from us as the work continues.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you to Switzerland, to Patricia, who came here with us here in Geneva. Thanks a lot for that. Look at the High Commissioner for Refugee Dialogue tomorrow that will focus on cooperation development. In particular, have a look at Spotlight Session 1 that will be looking into investing in the resilience of local governments and communities as first responders, which will be co-moderated by Vincent Cochetel, who was among us today, and Emilia Saiz from UCLG. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion that we'll hear in light of everything you know now from the study. Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye. I think they all deserve an applause. Merci.